my role really as chair here is to tell you a little bit about the context of the work that we've been doing that Tom's going to tell you about, and to introduce Tom himself. So really what we're trying to do is share with you today some of the University of Bradford's long-standing research that we've been doing within one of our research groupings called Visualising Heritage. The sort of work we do develops methods and capabilities to document, interpret, and present heritage using innovative and immersive digital heritage methods. And as you'll see, the sort of activities and capabilities that involves take many forms, from 3D scanning of objects and buildings to mapping landscapes both from the ground and from the air. And we focus on the importance of legacy, seeing the information value within the sorts of 3D data that we collect and drawing upon its long-term use. And importantly, the challenge of fusing some of these different types of data to build a rich composite understanding of places. Now, the term cultural heritage is really quite a broad one. It's a very broad brush that has many facets, ranging from the tangible, the objects, the buildings, the monuments and archaeological sites, and collectively their contextual landscape settings, whether in urban townscapes, as you're going to hear about today, or more remote rural or coastal locations. But increasingly, our work at Bradford has also focused on the contemporary, the societal context, that intangible heritage that can enrich with a greater awareness of the things that shape our individual and collective identities as part of cultural memory. That's the experiences and the narratives that may accompany something as simple as a photograph or a family recipe, perhaps handed down through the generations. A story, a song, dance, or even the importance of craft tradition, as you'll see in Tom's talk. Often the tangible and the intangible in terms of heritage are intertwined, and collectively they face many challenges. Challenges that are often magnified when seen in developing contexts, ranging from fragile societies and conflict through to natural disasters, as Tom's going to be talking about today. Now, some of the broader societal benefits around resilience and well-being that come from the way that we call upon heritage are things that we are only now starting to realize through some of the pioneering work led from Bradford. So it's a very exciting time for us as a broader team. And at the core of the digital heritage components to our work are those principles of conservation and documentation, offering support to heritage at risk. And as you'll hear from Tom, even addressing situations where that heritage has seemingly been lost. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you today Tom. Tom Sparrow is Senior Scientist in Visualising Heritage, based within the School of Archaeological and Forensic Sciences at the University of Bradford. Originally from Wiltshire, Tom trained in archaeological sciences and geophysical prospection here at the University of Bradford before working within commercial archaeology. He returned to work at the university and has been back for over 10 years, initially funded on a graduate traineeship from the Chartered Institute for Archaeology, but since has worked on a broad range of projects, from surveying latrines in Tanzania for a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation project, to using drones to capture the fossil-bearing landscapes of the Turkana Basin in Kenya with Louise Leakey as part of the Fragmented Heritage Project, as well as recording things closer to home, such as the remains of the world's earliest railway roundhouse as part of the infrastructure works, the enabling works as part of HS2. And here within this talk, mapping the temples and the squares of Kathmandu's UNESCO World Heritage Sites damaged during the 2015 earthquake, in collaboration between our Curious Travellers project and the UNESCO chair in Durham. So Tom, it's over to you for a talk entitled Visualising Heritage, Using Digital Technologies to Address Heritage Challenges, a case study from Kathmandu in Nepal.
Right, thanks Andy, that one for my introduction. So yes, so I'm going to go through and talk about some of the work that I carried out in 2018, following on from a project that we're doing called Curious Travellers. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So this talk is a reworking of a talk that I gave in 2018. That was actually delivered in Kathmandu as part of the project that Andy mentioned. So in 2015, there was an earthquake that struck in Nepal. The epicenter was near Kathmandu, and this caused widespread devastation of some of the outstanding temples and structures within the world and UNESCO sites. And these temples, some of them remain standing and some completely were leveled as part of the earthquake. So here's a map showing where the epicenter was in red, and then we see where Kathmandu is where I focused my research in terms of what we were asked to do as part of the UNESCO Chairs project from Durham. This project was a GCRF funded project looking at the seismic safety and the Kathmandu's historic urban infrastructure. So this was a project looking at why some of these temples collapsed, and some of them completely similar structures, and next did not. So this earthquake caused massive devastation for Kathmandu in terms of the population, where many thousands were killed, but also had a massive effect on the heritage and the destruction of these temples. Sadly, in the process of the earthquake, some of the people that were actually looking around these temples were killed or injured, which meant that when the emergency services got there to actually recover and save people, they inevitably then destroyed and lost some of the historic context of these temples in retrieving and saving other people's lives. So this work is a development from, as Andy said, I've been at the university now for 10 years, and over the course of those 10 years, I've worked on lots of different projects, going from recording and scanning and documenting the very small all the way up to the very large. So one of our key projects was called Digitalized Diseases, where we were scanning human remains, and then on from that we've gone to landscapes and other projects. So this is just a quick shot of some of the projects. This talk is the development of one of the projects called Curious Travellers, where we were looking at how to save and document heritage that was at risk or had been lost through various means. And obviously the earthquake in Nepal is one of those. So Curious Travellers was also a joint project between lots of universities and was part of Fragmented Heritage. And I'm part of a wider team. So Curious Travellers, the methodology that I used in Kathmandu was developed during the Curious Travellers project. So I know there's a lot of text here, but I'll skip over some of it. So just to talk about what's going on. So in the Curious Travellers project was a response to things that were going on at the time. So when we started the Curious Travellers project, it was the height when all the destruction was happening in Syria and ISIS were deliberately destroying monuments and heritage and trying to eradicate them off the map. So this was going on at the time that we were actually doing this project. There was a response directly to that. So heritage can be lost through numerous ways. Obviously, one of them can be conflict, specifically to do with Syria and ISIS, but also that has been a long-standing thing, also to do with World War I and World War II, and also goes back even further. So part of this project of Curious Travellers, we specifically looked at sites in Palmyra, but also Diocletian's Palace, and I'll talk about why that was one of the test sites as I go on with this talk. So heritage is always at risk from various reasons. So it can be cultural vandalism, so where people obviously are deliberately targeting and looting, and also graffitiing and doing various things to sites, and general erosion and everything else. So cultural vandalism is one of the aspects that we were looking at as part of this project. And this has obviously had a long history, specifically to do with looting and trying to get to the shiny things and destroying archaeology and heritage in the process. So specifically this talk, I'm going to end obviously with a case study with Kathmandu, Nepal. And this is obviously an ongoing thing. So during Curious Travellers, just at the start, we had the earthquake in Nepal, but we also had the earthquakes in Italy and in Myanmar as well. So as this project progressed, we were actually seeing this destruction happening as we were developing the process that I'm going to talk about. One of the reasons for doing this is to hopefully get people, as I talk about things, to actually be aware of this destruction and also try and mitigate and help record our heritage and our outstanding archaeology. One of the reasons and how we were able to do this is we were using existing data and harnessing the desire for people to help. So in this process of developing what I'm going to talk about in a few other slides, we basically used this willingness of people and pictures that already existed in data that existed to rebuild and create a documentation of a site that has been lost. And the idea is that we use this data to get people's mindsets and how you can help and engage and record archaeology when you're visiting these sites. The way that we did this is using a process called structure from motion or photogrammetry. So this is a long-standing structure that we use on a day-to-day basis for recording. We use computers to look at specific photographs and sets of photographs. And from these individual features that are in each individual feature and matched together, they allow people and computers to reconstruct environments and reconstruct the 3D nature of the object in the photograph from the 2D objects. So these is a quick image, quick set of images where the computer has analysed the features and matched specific parts and features from one photograph to another. And you keep doing this and linking pictures, and then you can create a 3D object. So this is a set of images of a mud brick structure in South America, where you can see the photo locations and then the reconstructed 3D object from those images. So normally, if I'm recording a site, I use a combination of photographs for doing photogrammetry and laser scanning to get a scale to the object. So photogrammetry is fantastic for getting color information and also the 3D nature of the object that you're photographing. But one of the fundamental flaws with photogrammetry is that you don't get the size of the object. In the computer, it could be any scale. So it could be minuscule when you actually come to look at the data, and you need some sort of reference to use to actually reconstruct and scale the object. So, and I'll talk about that later as to actually why I ended up going to Kathmandu. So we have two workflows, because obviously we're looking at sites that are no longer standing. So this project obviously was spawned from the destruction of other sites, so the temples in Nepal or sites in Palmyra. So we had to use existing data. So one of the ways that we did this is to look at web scraping images or crowdsourcing imagery. So this is existing imagery. So this is imagery that as tourists, you would go and take your holiday snaps and post online, or they are from locals documenting and taking pictures of the surrounding area. So the web scraping side of it, we're looking at data that somebody's put on social media or on the web, such as Flickr, or is part of the search from Google Images. And crowdsourcing is where we're specifically asking for imagery and getting donations sent to us. So part of the Curious Travelers process was to use these two workflows to look at how we can find existing imagery online, and then where it's lacking, ask and see if people will donate the imagery. In the process of doing this, we've got many thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of images, depending on the sites that we're looking at. So we have to have a way of managing and filtering the data. So within photogrammetry, or structure from motion, as it's called. So the idea is that, yeah, you move the camera and you can derive a 3D structure from that motion. It's predominantly normally used for looking at imagery that you've collected and photographed. So this is an ordered data set if you collect the data. In this project, we looked at unordered data. So this is data from lots of different sources, from lots of different cameras, lots of different times, and from lots of different people, which caused problems. So we had to work out a way of filtering the data. So this image shows a set of imagery from Palmyra, where the computer has analysed and looked at features in the imagery and how they relate to each other. So if you have a specific mark on a column or a specific stone that has some unique distribution of colour and shade, it uses these features to group stuff together, and eventually it starts matching similar structures and then grouping them together into clusters. And it is this we can then use to actually process and create 3D imagery. So every time you take an image, whether it's on a smartphone or on a camera, there's some data stored, this metadata that's stored within the image. So if it's taken with a smartphone, inside this, there can be GPS information and there can be other bits of information relating to the camera. So you can use this to do analysis and do some spatial distributions if it has GPS data. And whilst posting it on social media, most people tag sites. So you'll have a hashtag for various things, or you'll have a spatial tag which relates to a site. So you might want to put the name, you might want to put sunset, or you might want to put something else descriptive along with the social media post. It's these other information that we use. And here is an image showing some stuff in Palmyra where we plotted the distribution of the tags with the GPS positions and basically got an overview of what people were taking pictures of, and also having a look at how we can then find other pictures. And this is one of the key problems with some of the work in Kathmandu, is tourists have or tag and put lots of different names for similar structures. So when I go and talk about specific ones we did in Kathmandu, there might be a local name for a temple, and it's named after a deity, and the translations from different people mean that the different spellings and everything else become an issue, and we can use this spatial analysis and tagging to look at similarities in those distribution and to find more images. So here's just a close-up of a plot showing those tags, and you can look at the differences and how Syria and Palmyra are spelt in here, and also to do with Diocletian and various other bits and pieces. So it just gives you an idea of how different people from different locations use tagging, and also how translations get muddled sometimes. In this process, I started linking via natural language, similar in spellings, and I know you can't actually see the word cloud moving because it's low resolution, but you can just see that certain highlighted spots in how they link together in terms of similar spellings. So there's 2 red dots for Palmyra and Syria, and you can see how they all link together in this cloud, so you can get commonality and look for more imageries. And then on the right is a distribution of how frequent those words are within the collected images. So the bigger the dot, the more images have that tag. So you can then look at the commonality and what to look for going forward. Another thing is part of this that we'll be able to look at is the spatial analysis and the distribution and where people went to visit. So this just shows you a heat map of where all the photographs were taken for Palmyra, using GPS information and EXIF data to look at distributions. And you can see that there's hotspots that relate to the key locations, but also these key locations are along the road where most tourist buses run, and you literally jump out the tourist bus, take a picture, get back in and go to the next site. So some people don't really explore sites. There's some more analysis we've done on this that shows that sometimes areas were roped off, so pictures were never taken in those areas. So this is all stuff that we've been able to use the information that we've done to create a better understanding of sites. The issue with this is we couldn't really do this in Nepal because it was an urban area and GPS information is very unreliable. So in an open area, this is fantastic, but in urban settings with quite large structures, the GPS is then not useful. So the process we developed, we wanted to test whether this is a reliable way of doing it. So as I mentioned before, Diocletian's Palace was one of the sites that was looked at, primarily because we had some laser scan data. So this scan data allows us to reliably look at the data set we've produced via our Curious Travelers process, and then analyze it and match it to an existing data set to see how good the 3D model that we produced from web scraping and collecting all these photographs and processing them and analyzing it against a 3D model that we had. So we've done this with Diocletian's Palace, and you can see there is a small image here of a point cloud that's derived from the images, and then all the little red dots are the locations of photographs. And it was this model that we then used to compare against the laser scan data to see how reliable this is. We have also done this with Fountains Abbey. So Fountains Abbey is a site that we've been looking at for a long time by the university, looking at the upstanding and the below ground archaeology. So this is an example where we have some geophysics that we had from previous surveys, along with a 3D model derived from the photographs, along with combined with some LiDAR data, some aerial imagery, just to give you some context of the site and some idea of scale. By doing this and combining all these data sets, it allows us to produce very high resolution and very immersive 3D models that allow us to explore and understand sites better. So this is the combination of geophysics, LiDAR data, drone data, and laser scanning. And we use this as this comparison to see how good the reconstructions based on the crowdsourced photographs were. And over the process of this project, we found that it was very reliable as long as you had lots and lots of imagery. The images, in terms of numbers, as I said before, can be within the thousands, or in the case of Notre Dame in Paris, can be 1 million images, and they're taken. Obviously, it depends how easy and how popular a site is, but also how easy it is for somebody to tag it for us to then find. So the process that we've understood and gone through, we've done it on an ethical grounds, and also to look at it from a conservation point. So we only reconstruct 3D models if we have the data in the imagery, and don't try and make up imagery if we don't have enough pictures to produce it. So we basically try and create what we can from the data and not fill in the holes. There are other projects that will take this data further and then do reconstructions and add and embellish that data to provide a better understanding of the site. But for the course of this project, we were only looking at actually what we could actually derive from the data. So here are a few examples from Palmyra, just to show the process as it was and what the outputs were that we were producing at the end of Curious Travellers. And then I'll then go on to do with actually some talk more about the stuff in the pool and actually show how we developed the process. So these just look like some from the Temple of Bel. So that it was completely destroyed by ISIS. And we now have a VR environment where we can actually place people back in this environment and explore. And that was part of another project called Breathe, and where we were looking at taking refugees from Syria and actually letting them explore their lost heritage. So here are some examples to do with actually the urban setting and the destruction from the earthquake in Kathmandu. So this is an image from back to Paul Square. So this is an image very soon after the earthquake, where you can see that one temple has completely collapsed on itself, whilst other ones around it are left standing. And then here is an image of how this temple looked prior to the earthquake. And then below it is a partial reconstruction based on our crowdsourced imagery. So this site in Back to Paul was a good test case because it was quite an open square, but also it was a one temple that collapsed, whereas the rest of it was left standing. And I'll talk about why we now think this temple collapsed whilst the others were left standing. So here is a close-up of the same square, but from the point clouds from our derived 3D models. So in this image, you can see little blue triangles that relate to where we've computed where the picture was taken from. So the process of photogrammetry looks for these common features in the images to work out where the camera location is, and then derives the 3D nature of what was in the pictures. So in the process, we can then also reconstruct where the person took the picture. And if you build up a big picture, then this allows you to explore commonality within locations and various other bits and pieces. There are flaws in the data. So it only works if there are features in the photograph to analyze and reconstruct. So here we have a gap where there's a building that doesn't have many points. And the reason for this is in Kathmandu, every year, a lot of the buildings are whitewashed. It meant that this was a very white building, so it is very featureless, so it's very hard to reconstruct. Here is a 3D model that I've created of this temple that collapsed, and then superimposed is an image viewed from the person who took the image, and you can see how close that image matches onto the 3D reconstruction, simply because that picture was used to create that 3D reconstruction. There is a slight distortion with any camera in the lens, so we have to correct for that, and that's all part of the computation where you actually correct lens distortion and match features between all the cameras. Here's a close-up showing the raw point cloud as it comes out of the software. So this is a process that we developed to do with the unordered imagery. So if you use standard software and use it in a standard way, with unordered imagery, you can't get information like this. So we developed the computational pipeline that allows you to get this detailed information. Because it's unordered and pictures are taken in lots of different conditions, you tend to get this fuzziness around the image, and it ends up being what I call these sky pixels. So it's the the clouds around the picture when it's taken, they end up being part of the 3D model, and you have to clean those up to get a more representative model of the data. So here's just a quick shots where we've basically gone through the process of cleaning it up and processing and getting some of the noise, because ultimately there is noise in the imagery due to JPEG compression that ends up being in the data itself. So here is a more detailed 3D model of the temple. And over the course of the project, I also found out that there was actually some drawings made of the same temple in the 70s and 80s. So here is a line drawing of this temple. And there's then obviously the 3D reconstruction that I made. One of the problems with the earthquake in Kathmandu was that the earthquake destroyed the temples that were of interest, but also it damaged the buildings that kept some of the archives relating to these World Heritage sites. So Kathmandu is very risky in terms of it's a tropical area, so you get monsoons. And if you have any damage in the roof, obviously it gets water in, and then some of the paper records and the photographs of these monuments that were housed in Kathmandu were also lost because of the earthquake, but after the earthquake, because they were lost due to water damage. This one was actually a publication in a book, which I managed to find. And initially, when I gave this presentation and produced these graphics, when I went to Kathmandu, there was a difference in the drawing and my reconstruction. So initially, I left the animation where I didn't show the drawing for the top of the temple. It was through discussions in that presentation that I found out one of the reasons why this temple may have collapsed, and one of the outcomes from the core project from Durham for this was that actually in the 90s, from a slight earthquake, the top of this temple was previously damaged, and they repaired the very top using modern mortars and construction techniques. It meant that the top no longer matched the one that I'd reconstructed and this drawing, but also it explained one of the reasons why it collapsed, because modern mortars meant that the top of this temple was rigid and stuck together so that the energy from the earthquake couldn't dissipate. So basically, when the earthquake hit, you had this mass at the top that basically started to rock instead of absorbing the energy, and then fell through the rest of the temple, which caused this one to collapse, whereas all the other ones around it remained standing. So here's a side-by-side comparison between the drawing and the reconstruction. Just show the level of detail that we can get from the tourist pictures. And also, if you look at it, there are these subtle differences, as what I said with the reconstruction in the 90s. Here is then a quick rotation of the same model. And you can also see that the front of the temple has quite a nice reconstruction, whereas the side, it's very noisy, and that's basically due to the proximity to the next temple next to it. It means there's very little imagery to use for reconstruction. The process is not perfect. So with social media and people wanting to post selfies, if you ever take a picture as a selfie, you'll notice that images are mirrored or flipped, which means that if you take a selfie with you and the temple in it, then you end up with mirror images, which can cause problems with the model in the reconstruction, along with editing and photoshopping can cause problems. One of the other things that was an issue with Kathmandu was that quite regularly they'll have an image of the temple next to the temple, which means that sometimes the software matched a picture of the temple with a picture of itself next to it, and you've got this sort of infinity loop where you've got smaller versions inside the main 3D model just to confuse matters. So luckily I was able to go to Kathmandu to present the initial findings and that initial reconstruction of the temple. But one of the things that I couldn't do was give you an accurate size of the model to allow rebuilding and assist with the reconstruction. So I went for a week and we had an opportunity to hire this handheld laser scanner, which allows you to collect data very quickly. And it's very mobile. So I use this, which uses a process called SLAM, which basically means that it uses what it's collected to build up a map as you walk around. It's a very quick, and it allows you to get some very basic data to allow us then to scale the model. So here's a quick image of me carrying the equipment in Kathmandu after I did the main presentation. So this is a step well in the off the main square of Kathmandu. So this also illustrates one of the problems with Kathmandu in terms of doing this reconstruction. Is it's so densely packed that I managed to get lots of 3D reconstructions from small pieces of an area, but I didn't know where these small pieces actually fitted in the main global map of the structure. So when you have an open area, you tend to have one building which you get lots of photographs from the outside. Here we had lots of buildings that were closely packed and line of sight meant you couldn't see from one building to the next building. I've got lots of little models. This stepwell is quite an interesting one because it's quite a deep structure and it's below ground structure. So I had a 3D model of this, but I never knew where it went in the bigger picture of Kathmandu. So here is a quick image that shows what I was able to collect for the main Durbar Square in Kathmandu. And this was collected over the course of a couple of hours. That shows all the surviving structures along with some of the structures that collapsed. So a temple on top of here was completely lost. The main temple is called Kathmandu here, was completely leveled, and it's Kathmandu actually is the root of Kathmandu. It's the namesake temple, and also it is the focal point of the whole of Kathmandu, which was suddenly lost and completely flattened. There were quite a lot of people killed when that collapsed. So this is actually a structure over the top of the foundations project, and whilst archaeological excavations were being carried out. So this was a product of me quickly carrying this SLAM device over a couple of hours. Traditionally, if you were doing this recording method through normal means of normal static laser scanning or using other devices, this could be months worth of work to get the same level of accuracy, but also the same level of detail kept within it. There are some downsides, is you can't get colour information. So this is a representation based on height. So the blue areas are the lowest, and then the green going through to the red are the highest areas, so you can actually see the tall buildings and the trees related to the ground area. And this fuzziness is all the people walking around whilst I was collecting the data. Here's another image for Durbar Square, for Kathmandu, for Back to Core Square, where I was talking about this temple earlier, where you can actually see that I've got the scan data where you have the scaffolding that was holding up what was left of the temple after they removed the piles of rubble. So that is the scaffolding, and they'd also started to stabilize and rebuild when I collected this data. Then our 3D model scaled and put into place. And then here's some imagery of the rest of the reconstruction where you can see that same temple with some detail, its setting, and then an elevation shot of the other buildings. This one was also lost during the earthquake, and also the top of this one was lost. So this one was partially reconstructed whilst I went out in 2018, whereas this one was just getting ready to be reconstructed. So the imagery that I produced allowed the stonemason to start looking at how to reconstruct it. Basically, they had a pile of rubble, they had all the stonework that went into this structure, they just needed to figure out how they went together. And whilst I was there, I got to talk to the stonemason, whilst having this image on my phone and on the laptop, we actually were able to show where they had some masonry sorted out, where they didn't know where it actually went in terms of the roof, and you can actually see it on the the drawings and in the reconstructions to work out exactly where it fitted. So when they started to reconstruct and build it, they could put it back in the right place. Just to finish off, the equipment that we used to do that scanning, that slum device, was hired into the project. Since then, we've invested in buying the new model of it, and we're now using this to document the city and actually look at Bradford in terms of recording and documenting the heritage of our own city. And here's just a quick image showing a very quick scan of the town hall and then of the university campus. So the campus in the background, and then you've got City Hall in the foreground. And that concludes the talk.